Hi, everybody, and welcome back from a little break. I hope that most of you were able to watch the YouTube lecture, the lecture on persuasion that I had pre-recorded last week and I posted on YouTube. There's a link to it in Canvas, so you can watch that if you haven't watched that yet. And I can see that only about 60 people have watched it, I think, so far, so I know not everyone has. Make sure that you watch it before the exam 3, because obviously there's going to be material on the exam that I covered in that lecture. So just make sure you do that at some point and watch that lecture on persuasion, okay? There are a couple things I want to go over just before we get into today's lecture. First off, exam 2 short answers have not been graded yet. I talked to Emily Boutier, she was grading the assignment, and she says they should be up by Monday at the latest, okay? So your exam 2 short answers will be posted by about Monday. So don't worry if you don't see any grade up there yet, they will be up there. Secondly, I want to go over the first assignment so you can see roughly how that was graded. So let me share my screen with you. Okay, so this is roughly how I'm grading, or how the first assignment was graded. Okay, so if you recall, you had to watch a clip from the show It's Always Sunny in Philadelphia, and I asked a couple questions about how the characters were reducing their cognitive dissonance. And so the first question is, what caused the characters' cognitive dissonance? This is worth 2 points. What you needed to say here is you needed to identify what the behavior was that was in conflict with the attitude. Okay, so you can't just say, or you shouldn't have just said, they behaved in a way that conflicted with their attitudes. You had to be specific to the situation. Okay, so the idea in this clip was that these are people who owned a bar, and they realized they were making a lot of money, and it turns out that what was happening is that it was a lot of underage kids that were going to their bar, and that's why they were making so much more money. And so what caused their cognitive dissonance in the first place was a conflict between their behavior, which was that they were serving alcohol to underage kids, and their attitude, which is something along the lines of, it's wrong to serve underage kids because it's dangerous, or I shouldn't serve them. Okay, so that's where that conflict originates. So if you said something along those lines, you got 2 points for that part of the assignment. The second question was, how did the characters actually reduce their cognitive dissonance? So what I wanted you to do is mention which of the 5 dissonance reduction strategies we had talked about in class, which of those 5 they used, and explain how it worked, why it was successful. There are a couple answers you could have given here. The best answer is that they added a consonant to cognition. Okay, so when you add a consonant cognition, what you're doing is you're adding a belief that's consistent with your attitude and your behavior. So what they did in that clip is they convinced themselves, look, if we don't serve alcohol to these underage kids, then they're going to start drinking in public parks and they're going to get mugged, and it's going to be dangerous for them. So actually, by serving underage kids, we're creating a safe haven for them. Okay, so they added a new belief. The belief was, we're providing a safe haven for these kids. And if they could convince themselves that in fact what they were doing was actually good for the kids, then that belief is very consistent with the fact that they were serving alcohol to these kids. Okay, so to get full points, you should have said they added a consonant cognition and explained what that was. Explain that they were adding this belief that they're providing a safe haven for these kids. There are other answers that are okay depending on how you explain them. If you had said that they minimized the importance of the conflict, that could be okay. You may get 3 out of 4 or something like that for that. So if you had explained that they acknowledged that there was a discrepancy between their attitude and their behavior, but it's not that big a deal. So in other words, we're serving underage kids alcohol. We shouldn't be doing that, but it's not that big a deal because otherwise they would be getting in trouble, and so they'd be doing it anyway, and so it's not that big a deal that we're doing it. I could accept that partially. It's not quite as good as adding a consonant cognition, but depending on how you explained it, you get partial points for an answer like that. The third question is to provide 2 alternative ways that they could have reduced their cognitive dissonance. So if you said that they added a consonant cognition in part 2, there are 4 other ways that people can reduce their dissonance. And so you should have taken 2 of those and explained in this context what that would mean. And so some sample answers would be something like this. If you said that they could have changed their attitude, so this is the attitude here, or sorry, this is their attitude from part 1, that it's wrong to serve underage kids alcohol. So if they were able to convince themselves that it's not actually wrong to serve underage kids alcohol, or if they could convince themselves that alcohol is not dangerous to kids or something along those lines. Those would be examples of changing their attitude to bring it in line with their behavior. So that theoretically could have worked as a way to reduce their dissonance. You could have mentioned that they could have changed their behavior. This is the simplest one, meaning they could just stop serving alcohol to underage kids. If they stop serving alcohol, then there's no conflict between their behavior and their attitudes. Now, in the context of that clip, of course, this would reduce their cognitive dissonance, but it also means that it would cost them money. So they're not necessarily motivated. The characters aren't necessarily motivated to change their behavior, even though it would reduce their dissonance, because it would cost them money to do so, which is why they tended to look for another way of reducing their dissonance. I explained this one a second ago. They can minimize the importance of the conflict. So if they can come to convince themselves that it's not a big deal that they're serving underage kids alcohol, either because they're going to do it anyway, because it's not that dangerous, whatever, something along those lines would be an example of minimizing the importance of the conflict. And lastly, they could have reduced their perceived choice. In other words, if they could come to convince themselves that they had no choice but to serve kids alcohol. So, the business is going to fail. We're going to go bankrupt. We're going to lose all our money unless we serve them alcohol. So we had to do it, or something along those lines. Then that would theoretically also reduce their dissonance. Okay, so you get 2 points for each of the two alternative ways that they could have reduced their dissonance. If you have any questions about your grade on the assignment, probably the best thing to do is to contact the TA directly, since she's the one that graded them using this rubric that I gave her. So she can go over your assignment with you if you want to talk to her about that. If you're still unsatisfied with your grade after talking to her, then you can come to me and then I can make a final decision on whether to change your grade. Now, it's pretty rare that I would actually change your grade. Usually the TA will take care of any questions or any issues that you have. But if you're still unsatisfied, you're able to do that. Okay, so what I want to do is finish talking about persuasion. And so, as I mentioned, the pre-recorded lecture that I recorded and put on YouTube was all about persuasion. But I didn't get to the end of that lecture. I still have about 3 slides left. So this slide that I have posted right now, this is an overview of everything I covered in that pre-recorded lecture that's already on YouTube. So I'm not going to go over this now, but definitely definitely watch that video if you have not seen it yet. But we talked all about the ways that people are persuaded and some of the factors that can lead people to become persuaded. But what I want to finish this section by talking about, I want to finish by talking about ways that persuasion can fail, or ways that persuasion can even backfire. So in other words, there are some situations where people might be trying to persuade us to do something by trying to change our attitudes towards something that can completely fail or even backfire. And I want to talk about in particular, two techniques or 2 phenomena that demonstrate this idea that these persuasion attempts can fail. And the first one is a phenomenon known as attitude inoculation. And as the name implies, this idea draws from medicine, the idea of vaccination. So if you get vaccinated, like with a flu vaccine or something, what's happening is you're being injected with a really, really weak version or a dead version of the flu. And when your body's exposed to that really weak or dead version of the flu, it creates these antibodies. So that way, when you're actually exposed to the actual flu, your body's already prepared to fight it off. That's basically how vaccinations work. The basic idea is that if you're exposed to a weak version of the flu, that allows you to fight off the stronger version later on. And analogously, when people are exposed to a weak version of an argument, and I'll explain what that means in a second, that leads them to be better able to fight off later persuasion attempts. So for instance, if I were to tell you that at the end of today's lecture in an hour, I'm going to change your political opinions or something along those lines. I'm giving you a forewarning, in other words, that later on, I'm going to try to change your opinions. What happens is that when you're exposed to that forewarning, it's kind of like you develop antibodies. You become later more resistant to changing your attitudes later on. In other words, my persuasion attempts are more likely to fail if I give you this forewarning that I'm later going to try to change your opinions. And I'll give you an example of a study that looked at this. What this study looked at is they gave a talk, researchers gave a talk to high school students. about why there was I think like a petition to raise the legal driving age from 16 to 18. Okay. And they randomly assigned these students to one of two conditions. And the first condition, they gathered all the students in a room and they just sprung this talk on them. The students had no idea what the talk was going to be about. The talk just suddenly started and they were trying to convince the students about why it's a good idea to raise the legal driving age from 16 to 18. In the other condition, in the forewarned condition, what happened is the researchers told the students 10 minutes before the talk began, they said, okay, in 10 minutes, we're going to try to change your opinions on the benefits of raising the legal driving age from 16 to 18. So they're basically given a 10-minute warning about what's going to happen. So everybody then gets the exact same speech about why we should raise the legal driving age from 16 to 18. And later on, the researchers asked each individual person, each individual student, to rate how much they agree with that idea, with raising the legal driving age. And what they showed is that in the control condition, when people weren't forewarned, when they weren't given that 10-minute warning, their attitudes changed. They were persuaded by the speaker, and they were more in favor of raising the legal driving age. But among the students who were forewarned, who got that 10-minute warning, their attitudes didn't budge at all. Okay, so giving them that forewarning inoculated them from the later persuasion attempts. And there's a couple of reasons why this is the case. First off, when you forewarn people, if you give them a heads up, a 10-minute warning that in 10 minutes I'm going to try to change your opinions, that gives people 10 minutes to generate counter arguments. So in this example, the students in this study, they had 10 minutes to think about why it's a bad reason or a bad idea to increase the legal driving age. So that way, when the researchers started to try to convince them why it's a good idea to raise the legal driving age, well, they're talking to students who are already armed with all these counter arguments, right? As a consequence, the persuasion attempts are going to be doomed to fail. So that's one reason. It gives people time to generate counter arguments. But there's a second sort of related idea for why attitude inoculation works, and that's because it produces this sort of motivational reaction on our part. So if I were to tell you in 10 minutes, I'm going to change your political beliefs, then you might say, you know what? Yeah, right. You just try to change my political beliefs, right? In other words, you don't want to think of yourself as someone who's easily manipulated by people, that changes your opinions all the time, is wishy-washy, right? You've had these political beliefs for years. So who am I to try to change them or to say that I can change them in the next few minutes? You've got this motivation where you don't want to be or have your attitudes change because you want to feel like you're the originator of your beliefs, right? And that motivational reaction is otherwise known as psychological reactance. Okay, the idea behind psychological reactance is that you feel as an adult that you have certain freedoms that you are able to exercise and that people shouldn't tell you what to do, right? And so when people try to impose restrictions on your freedoms, when they try to take your freedoms away, we really don't like that, right? We really don't like when people try to take our freedoms away. And so what happens is that we often react against those threats to our freedom by perceiving that threatened freedom, the thing that someone else is trying to take away. We want that thing even more right now. As soon as we feel like someone's trying to tell us not to do something, then we just really, really want to do that thing. And that's known as psychological reactance. And this is what I mean when I said that persuasion attempts can sometimes backfire. Because if I tell you that I am going to change your political opinions, that because of psychological reactance, if you feel like I'm trying to change your opinions, you might adopt an even stronger position, making it even harder for me to change your opinions, right? This cartoon sums up psychological reactance quite well. So there's a sign saying absolutely no machete juggling, and this man is saying, suddenly I have an urge to juggle machetes, right? Now, he didn't have that urge prior to seeing the sign telling them that he can't do it. But as soon as we tell people they can't do something, then all of a sudden that's what they want to do. And that's due to psychological reactance. It's kind of a way of saying, you can't tell me what to do, I'm going to do what I want to do. Okay, so in other words, these persuasion attempts can backfire. If I try to tell you I'm going to change your opinion on something, you may adopt an even stricter opinion on your original opinion, right? You may move in a direction the opposite of the one that I'm trying to get you to move in, to sort of show me that I can't manipulate you. and that leads to all sorts of backfiring effects. So for instance, this was a study that looked at, I think it was teenagers in dating relationships. And they looked at whether the parents of these teenagers approved of that relationship or not. And what they showed was that among those teenage couples where the parents disapproved of their relationship, they tended to last longer, those relationships, than when parents approved of the relationship. And you might have experienced this yourself. Maybe you're dating someone and maybe your parents don't approve of your partner, but you don't feel like your parents should be able to tell you who you're allowed to date. And so what happens is, just to kind of stick it to your parents, you stick with that person even longer, right? To prove to your parents that you can decide who you want to date. This is also partly why things like warning stickers can backfire. So if there's a book or a movie or something and someone's trying to censor it and say, you know, you should not read this book, you should not watch that movie. Well, what happens? You just really want to read that book, right? You really want to watch that movie. And so these warning stickers that try to persuade people not to do something can often backfire and can lead people to want to do that thing even more. And this idea of psychological reactance has been studied in numerous research studies as well. In this study, what researchers did is they went to public bathrooms and they put one of two signs on the walls of each of these public bathrooms that they went to. In one sign, and all these signs were about why you shouldn't write on the walls. For half of the bathrooms, they got a sign that said, please do not write on the walls, a very sort of soft warning. For the other half of the bathrooms, they got a sign that said something like, under no circumstances should you ever write on these walls. So a much stricter statement on these signs. And they left and they came back a couple weeks later, and all they did is they measured basically how much graffiti was on the walls of these public bathrooms. And what they showed is that for those bathrooms where they had the strict sign saying under no circumstances should you ever write on these walls, there was more graffiti on those walls than the bathrooms that had a sign with only a soft warning saying please don't write on the walls. The idea here is that you can imagine you're one of these people and you go to this public restroom and it says under no circumstances should you ever write on the walls. You start thinking, oh yeah, I'll show you, I'll write all over these walls, right? That's psychological reactance, right? You're telling me I can't do something, I'm gonna do it just to show you that I can. Okay, that's all I have on the persuasion section. Again, I just finished the last few slides to continue off of the pre-recorded lecture I did on persuasion. So what I want to do now is, let's see, where are we here? Is go to the next lecture on compliance. Oops. So we're still under the general heading of social influence. So far we've looked at two different types of social influence. Last week we looked at conformity. And remember, conformity is sort of changing our behaviors to match what we think other people are doing. And that was, in a sense, the weakest form of social influence, in the sense that we'll often conform our behaviors, even if no one is trying to get us to change our behaviors. Even if no one's trying to get us to change, we'll often conform to what they're doing. The pre-recorded lecture that I posted on YouTube was on persuasion. And when we talk about persuasion, we're talking about people who are deliberately trying to change our attitudes. So if you think about like commercials and ads, these are corporations that are trying to change your attitudes towards their product. And the idea is that if you develop a more positive attitude towards the corporation or towards their product, eventually that'll change your behavior, they'll buy their product. When we're talking about compliance, we're ratcheting up the social influence even more. Because what we're talking about when we talk about compliance is people making direct requests to change your behavior. That's what differentiates compliance from, say, persuasion, where the attempt is only to change your attitude. Now we're talking about behavior change in response to a direct request. So this is when people say, hey, can you do this for me? We've already seen an example, or well, I guess I'll talk about this first. So one of the themes that runs through this section on compliance, and it ran through the last section on persuasion as well, but one of the themes that runs through this section as well is that of mindlessness. And what that means is that because we've seen before that we don't really like to think a lot if we can avoid it, we often respond sort of mindlessly to certain cues. We saw that a lot when we looked at the persuasion section, and we're seeing it again as it pertains to compliance as well. And the thing is that people who are trying to get you to comply with them, they often know that you will behave mindlessly, and they can manipulate you very subtly because of your tendency to behave sort of mindlessly. So we're going to look at some of the general principles that get people to comply and some of the specific techniques that people often will use on you to try to increase your likelihood of complying. And we're going to see psychologically why these techniques work. But they often rely on this tendency for us to behave sort of mindlessly, as we'll see. We've already seen an example of compliance in this class. I think it was on the very first day of the semester. I talked about this guy who would call into fast food restaurants like McDonald's and talk to the manager, as he's doing here. This one is the manager of McDonald's. And basically, he would tell the manager that someone has been stealing money at McDonald's. He would identify himself as Officer Scott, and he would say someone's stealing money. And he would basically make requests of the manager to see what he could get away with. So he would make a request to, in this case, bring Louise Ogborn to the back and accuse her of stealing, and then go through her purse and search her and strip search her and all these sorts of things. And when I talked about the story, I had mentioned that the manager, and not just the manager of this McDonald's, but this happened like dozens and dozens of times, these managers behave sort of mindlessly. Just the very fact that this person identified himself as Officer Scott got these managers to do all sorts of things, including very illegal things, such as strip searching an employee, which is not a legal thing to do. But these people went along with it, not necessarily because they're inherently immoral people, but because they were behaving mindlessly to these sorts of requests. This is something we all tend to do, behave mindlessly to some extent or another. And so being aware of these techniques that people use that rely on you behaving mindlessly will hopefully lead you to be better able to protect yourself from these sorts of techniques that other people will use to manipulate you in the future. So the main researcher who is most associated with looking at compliance and the various principles and techniques that people use to get you to comply, his name is Robert Cialdini. What he did to study these techniques is he went undercover as a used car salesman. And I think he did this for like 2 years. And he did this in order to study the different techniques that used car salesmen would use on their customers. And based on what he observed in that environment, he generated 6 principles of compliance. And these are those 6 principles here. He actually wrote a book based on this. The book is called Influence. His name is Robert Cialdini. The last name is spelled Cialdini. It's a really, really interesting book, and it's written for non-social psychologists, although it talks a lot about social psychology. It's a really, really interesting book about all sorts of techniques that people use on you in order to get you to comply to do things. I strongly recommend it if you're interested in this topic to see some of the other techniques that people use on you. And they're really sneaky, these techniques. But in any case, he organized that book in terms of these 6 general principles. We're going to talk about each one in turn. So we're going to come back and talk about the latter 5 here, but we're going to start with this first one. We're going to start with reciprocity. Now, as we're going to see, a principle is a general psychological idea. I'm going to differentiate that from techniques. A technique is a very specific tactic that people will use that often rely upon general principles. So these are the 6 principles. And as we go through and talk about each one, I'll talk about some various techniques that people use based on these principles. Okay, the general principle of reciprocity is fairly simple. It's this general idea that exists socially, at least in this culture, that says that we should treat others as they treat us. So in other words, if someone does us a favor, we sort of owe them a favor, right? Now, for people we're close with, our family members, our good friends, we don't necessarily keep track of who owes who what. But for other types of relationships, like acquaintance relationships, there's kind of this belief that if someone does something for us, we owe them something in the future. And there's good social reasons for why this principle exists, right? It's kind of a social lubricant to some degree. It kind of tries to maintain equity in these sorts of relationships. But the thing is that because of our mindless tendency to behave reciprocally, I guess that's the word I'm looking for, reciprocally, people can take advantage of that. In other words, what people can often do is make it look like they're doing you a favor because they know that if you think they're doing you a favor, you feel like you owe them something. Okay, so we're going to get to that in just a second. But just to first off show that this principle exists at some level in the society, this is a very, very basic study where what researchers did is they bought hundreds of Christmas cards. And they got a phone book and they picked random people out of the phone book and they mailed a Christmas card to, it was 578 random people out of this phone book. And all they wrote in this Christmas card was something like Happy Holidays from Bob and Sue or something like that. And they had a return address on the envelope. So what they were really interested in is whether these 578 people who got a random card from from a couple they had never met before, they never even heard of, they wanted to know if these people would send them a card in return. And in fact, somewhere around 20% of them actually did. 117 of these people sent a card back to the researchers in return. And almost none of them actually said that, hey, I have no idea who you are. They just pretend like Happy Holidays from us as well. Now this demonstrates this idea of reciprocity, that if someone gave us a card, we owe them a card back. I've seen this happen with things like weddings and things like that, where like a friend of mine will invite someone that they know. And then when that person gets married, they feel like they have to invite the friend that had invited them years before to their wedding. Because if they had done me a favor, I owe them a favor as well. That's the principle of reciprocity. And so, as I mentioned, people who know that this principle exists will oftentimes use it against you by making it seem like they're doing you a favor. I'll give you an example. So I'll describe this technique. This is a specific technique that people use, something called the door in the face technique, that they use to get you to do what they want you to do. And it's a really simple idea here. It's only a two-step process. People who use the door in the face technique do the following. The first thing they do is they make a really large request, and they completely expect to be turned down by this request. So maybe they go to you and they say, hey, would you be willing to donate $50 to this cause? And this is just a stranger that you've never met before. And chances are you're not going to just donate $50 and give $50 to someone that you've just met, right? But the thing is that they know that's going to happen. They know they're going to get rejected. In fact, they're counting on it. Because once they get rejected, then they reduce the size of the request. Okay, you don't want to donate $50. Well, how about if you donate $5 to this cause? Now, what happens is that when people use the door in the face technique, people are more likely to agree to the smaller request because it feels like the requester has done them a favor. I mean, after all, they wanted $50 to begin with, and now they're willing to settle for $5. They've dropped their request from $50 to $5. That's a big concession to make. That's a favor they're doing for you. And because it feels like they're doing you a favor, you feel a need to return the favor, which you'll often do by agreeing to that smaller request. But of course, they didn't really do you a favor because they manipulated you. They asked for this $50 that they knew you were going to reject. The only reason they asked it is because when you rejected it, it felt to you like they were doing you a favor by dropping the magnitude of that request. And so I'll give you an example of the door in the face technique. But it relies on this idea that we feel a need to return a concession or to return a favor. It feels as if they're doing us a favor by dropping the size of that request. We feel a need to return that favor, which makes us more likely to agree to that smaller request. So for instance, this is a study where researchers tried out the door in the face technique to see if it would work. And so what they did is they went up to random people and they asked them one of two things. They randomly assigned them to one of two conditions. So people in the control condition were asked the following question. Would you be willing to serve as unpaid chaperones for juvenile delinquents on a day trip to the zoo? It's a fairly large request, right? Probably if you're a random person, if you get asked this, you're probably not going to say, yeah, I'll take unpaid, or I'll take juvenile delinquents to the zoo and get paid nothing for it. On the other hand, people in the experimental group, these are people who were in the door in the face technique group. They were first asked the following question. Would you be willing to serve as unpaid counselors to juvenile delinquents for 2 hours per week for 2 years? Okay, so in other words, would you be willing to donate 200 hours of your time for no money to counsel juvenile delinquents. And as you can imagine, everyone says no to this, right? No one is going to say yes to a stranger to donate just 200 hours of their time to do this. Once they say no, the researchers then followed up with the following question. No? Okay, well, would you be willing to serve as unpaid chaperones for juvenile delinquents on a day trip to the zoo? The exact same question that people in the control group got. So what we're going to look at on the next slide is the percentage of people who agreed to this request to serve as unpaid chaperones for juvenile delinquents on a day trip to the zoo. So in the control condition, in other words, when there was no first large request, when people were simply outright asked if they would take these kids to the zoo, you get something like 17% of people agree. The vast majority of people say no, but 17% of people agree. But among people who had first received this really large first request, okay, where they were asked, would you serve as an unpaid counselor for 2 years? People, and everyone said no. And only then were they asked if they would go to the zoo with these juvenile delinquents. That number drastically increases to 50%. It roughly tripled the likelihood that people would agree to that request. And the only thing that led to that increase in people agreeing to that second request is the fact that they had turned down a much larger request a minute ago. The very act of turning down that large request made these people feel like they owed the request or something, and therefore they were more likely to agree to that second request. So Calvin, in this comic strip, is using the door-in-the-face technique on his mom. So, Mom, can I set fire to my bed mattress? No, Calvin. Can I ride my tricycle on the roof? No, Calvin. Then can I have a cookie? But his mom has taken social psychology. She knows what's happening. So no, Calvin, she's on to me. Okay, so what's happening here? What's happening here is that when Calvin is asking to set fire to his bed mattress, to ride his trike on the roof, he doesn't really want those things. He's asking because he knows he's going to get turned down by his mom. He's making a really, really large request. Can I do these things? Knowing he's going to get turned down, with the idea that if his mom turns him down from these large requests, she's more likely to agree to the smaller request, which is all he really wanted anyway. He wants a cookie, right? So he's using the door-in-the-face technique on his mom in this comic strip. We see examples of reciprocity in general and door-in-the-face techniques in particular in all sorts of different contexts. And I'll give you a couple contexts. If you're like me, then the best part of going grocery shopping are the free samples that they give out, right? Like I hate doing chores like grocery shopping, but if I see them giving out free samples, okay, I kind of like that, right? But if you're also like me, you can't just go directly to the free sample person. You have to sort of walk slowly by it and like hope that they call you over and offer you something. And you've got to like pretend you didn't see them and like, oh, okay, yeah. And so what happens is that these grocery stores, of course, aren't just giving you free things because they're nice. They're doing it because it makes them money. And it makes them money in a couple of ways. One way is that it's, of course, it introduces you to their products. You're more likely to buy the product. But maybe more importantly, what they're doing is they're making it feel as if they're doing you a favor. Here's a free thing. So here's some free food for you. They've now done you a favor. And because of this principle of reciprocity, you sort of feel a need to return that favor. And so if you're like me, after I get a free sample and they say, well, now that you've tried this product, would you like to buy our product? I can't just say no. What I have to do is make excuses. Well, yeah, okay, that does look good. I did kind of like it. I don't know. I got to think about it. Maybe I'll come back to you. And I make all these sorts of stupid excuses, right? Now, why do we do that? Why do we feel guilty, in other words, if we don't buy the product? Well, we sort of feel guilty because they've done us a favor and now we're saying, no, we don't want to return that favor. And that violates this principle of reciprocity. It's sort of awkward, right? Now, if we think about it logically, the person who's giving us these free samples, they don't care if we buy the product. They're not the CEO of the company. They're not making money every time they sell a box of crackers, right? And yet we still feel guilty, right? We still feel guilty if we don't actually buy that product. And so grocery stores capitalize on this tendency that we have, this principle of reciprocity. by giving us free things because we often feel a need to return the favor, not just return the favor. We often will buy the product, which is a much bigger favor in a sense than what they gave us in the first place. The door in the face technique was actually used by Seth MacFarlane, who's the creator of the show The Family Guy. I think it's on some DVD and some director's commentary. He talks about this. He has a technique. So when he writes the show, he's got certain jokes that he doesn't know if he's going to be able to get past the censors. The censors, the network may come back and say, no, you cannot put this on TV. And he's got certain jokes that he's trying to get in there. And so what he does, whenever he has a joke that he's trying to get into the show, but he's afraid the censors won't let him, is he will write that episode with all sorts of really over-the-top jokes that he knows there's no way the censors will ever let him put on the air. And he specifically does that. So that way, when the censors come back and say, no, you cannot put these things on the air, he can say, okay, well, I'll tell you what, I'll take out this joke and this joke and this joke, and just do me one favor, just leave this one joke in there. Now, that's the only joke he ever wanted in the first place, right? He's manipulating the censors. What he's doing is he's asking for a lot, knowing he's going to get turned down. So that way, when he backs off that request and he asks for the smaller request, just keep this one joke in there, the censors are much more likely to agree to that. Okay, that's the definition, basically, of the door in the face technique. In fact, I would argue that the door in the face technique is effectively responsible for the downfall of Richard Nixon when he had to resign in disgrace. So just to give you sort of a very brief overview, history lesson here of what happened. This is when Richard Nixon was president, and a committee that was working for him, that was trying to help his re-election bid, he's up for re-election at the time, a committee that was working for him basically broke in to the Watergate Hotel where the Democrats had their offices, and they burglarized their offices and they wiretapped them, things which are obviously highly illegal, right? You're not allowed to do this. That sort of conspiracy quickly started to unravel, and on the basis of that, of the Watergate scandal, that ultimately led to Richard Nixon resigning in disgrace. Okay. Now, breaking into the Watergate Hotel and wiretapping the offices was a pretty dumb idea, but it's even dumber than most people realize, in part because Nixon was almost surely going to win re-election anyway. Unless the Republicans did something really stupid, Nixon was going to win re-election, so there's no point in breaking into these offices, and the Democrats didn't have any information anyway. Okay, so there's really no upside to doing this, but there's a huge downside, because if you get caught, well, it would lead to the resignation of Nixon, right? So what happened? In fact, the people on the committee who were ultimately responsible for making the decision to break into the Watergate Hotel later said, how could we have been so stupid? Okay, well, I'll tell you how. What happened is this. A guy by the name of G. Gordon Liddy came to this committee and he said, you know what, I've got this fantastic plan to help Nixon win re-election. Here's my plan. I'm going to get these spy planes. We're going to get these planes, and they're going to tail Democrats secretly. They're going to spy on Democrats to see what they're doing. And we're going to rent out these giant yachts, and we're going to fill them with call girls. We're going to get the Democrats on the yachts with these call girls, and we're going to blackmail them. And I got this whole sabotage thing. There's a whole mugging thing involved. I got this whole big plan, and I'll tell you what, I can put this in motion for $1 million. And the committee looked at him and said, you're crazy. There is no way we're giving you $1 million to do all these things. So G. Gordon leaves and comes back a little later and says, okay, I'll tell you. Let me get rid of the spy plane. Let me get rid of the yacht and the call girls, but I still have the sabotage scheme, this mugging scheme, and it involves breaking into the hotel at Watergate and wiretapping. It involves all those things. I'll tell you what, for $500,000, I'll do that. And the committee looked at him again and said, no, that's crazy. We're not going to give you $500,000 to do that. So he leaves and he comes back a third time. And when he comes back a third time, he says, okay, here's my last offer. So I got rid of the spy plane, the yacht and the call girls, the sabotage and the mugging, get rid of all that. All I want to do is break into the Watergate Hotel and wiretap the Democrats. And I'll do it for $250,000. And they looked at him and they said, okay. So what happened here? Well, obviously what happened is that G. Gordon Liddy went into this meeting with a really, really large request. I want a spy plane and yacht and call girls and mugging and wiretapping and sabotage and burglarizing. And he got turned down, and he reduced the size of his request to a smaller request. And because he did that, which is basically the door in the face technique, that led the committee to be more likely to agree to his smaller request. And I'm not just speculating here. These are words that were spoken by people on the committee. In fact, here's a statement by one of them right here. After starting at the grandiose sum of $1 million, we thought that probably $250,000 would be an acceptable figure. We were reluctant to send him away with nothing. Why were they reluctant to send him away with nothing? Because he had already made 2 concessions at that point. He had already agreed to drop his price from $1 million to $500,000, and then again from $500,000 to $250,000. And if he's willing to make those concessions, we feel a need to return that favor. Maybe this statement by one of the committee members is an even better summary of door in the face. There's almost no better summary of what happened than this. What they said is the following. If he had come, he being G. Gordon Liddy, if he had come to us at the outset and said, we have a plan to burglarize and wiretap Larry O'Brien's office, we might have rejected the idea out of hand. Instead, he came to us with his elaborate call girl kidnapping, mugging, sabotage, wiretapping scheme. He had asked for the whole loaf and he was quite content to settle for half or even a quarter. And this is exactly right. What they're saying is that if he had asked us outright to wiretap the offices, to break into the Watergate Hotel, we would have said no. But what happened is he came to us with this really large request. He then dropped the magnitude of that request. We felt the need to return that favor, and therefore we allowed him to wiretap the Democrats. That's what led to the Watergate scandal. And so you can say that the door in the face technique indirectly led to the downfall of arguably the most powerful man on the planet. And had this committee only known about social psychology, maybe the Watergate scandal never happens and history changes for good. Okay, so that's the first principle, the principle of reciprocity. A second principle of compliance is something we've sort of seen before. This is the principle of commitment and consistency. This is the idea that once we make a commitment to something, once we verbally, say, agree to something, we feel a pressure to behave consistently with that commitment. And when I say we've seen this idea before, we've sort of seen this idea with cognitive dissonance. I mean, after all, cognitive dissonance arises when our behaviors and our attitudes don't match, right? So to avoid cognitive dissonance, we feel a need to behave consistently with our prior commitments. That way we never have to worry about this uncomfortable dissonance that arises. Now, again, there's lots of good reasons for this principle, right? We don't want to be hypocrites. It's probably a good thing that we don't act overly hypocritical. But again, people who try to manipulate you know that you have a tendency to behave consistently with your prior commitments. And knowing that, they will use strategies on you to try to get you to commit to something, even if it's just a verbal commitment to something. Knowing that by verbally committing to something, that makes you more likely to behave consistently with that commitment later on. And I'm going to describe 2 different techniques that capitalize on this tendency we have to want to behave consistently with our past commitments. But first, let me describe some general ideas, some general findings that are consistent with this idea of commitment and consistency. Okay. This first study is pretty simple. What researchers did is they went to the beach and they found an unwitting participant, so someone who's at the beach who doesn't know they're part of the study. Right? So what the researcher does is they go pretty much next to this person, they lay out their towel, they pull out a radio, they slip the radio up, they start relaxing on the beach. And after a few minutes, that person gets up to leave. And at that point, they randomly assign the person beside them to one of 2 conditions. So for half of these participants, they're in the control condition. So what happens is the researcher, after relaxing for 5 minutes, just stands up, doesn't say anything to that participant, and just walks off. In the other condition, what happens is the researcher turns to the person beside them and says, "Excuse me, I'm going to take a walk. Would you mind watching my things?" To which everyone says yes. You've probably been asked by a stranger, "Hey, can you just watch my things for a second?" Or maybe you've asked someone else to do it, right? And everyone says yes when you do this, right? So just a simple request. So, sure, I'll watch your things. Okay, so the researcher walks off again. So the researcher's gone for a few minutes, and then some other guy starts walking down the beach. And he's looking around and he sees this towel with a radio, and there's no one there. And he looks around and he grabs the radio and he runs off. Now, what the researchers, this is all staged, of course. Now, what the researchers want to know is, will the participant chase after the radio thief? So this is the percentage of people who intervened, in other words, who chased after or who said something to the radio thief. So in the control condition, these are people who were never, the researcher never talked to them, okay? And only about 20% of people actually did anything. So the vast majority of people just watched this thief run off with the radio, did nothing. Right? But in this condition in which the researcher first turned to this person and said, hey, could you please watch my things? And that person said yes. Now suddenly 95% of people did something. There was one case where the guy ran after the thief and tackled him into the sand to try to get this radio back. Now this is a huge, huge difference. We don't see differences like this in psychology. This is a huge, huge effect. And the only difference between these two groups was that people in this group had agreed, yes, I'll watch your things. And because of this need we have to behave consistently with our past commitments, well, if I've committed to saying I will watch your things, then if someone takes your things, I feel it's my responsibility to get them back because I've committed to them. Okay, so this demonstrates our general tendency to want to behave consistently with our past commitments. Even a commitment as sort of mindless as saying, yeah, sure, I'll watch your things. Telephone solicitors, so people who might cold call you to try to get you to donate money to a cause or something like that, have techniques that are really, really subtle, relying on the principle of commitment and consistency. In fact, they're so subtle you have no idea they're even using them on you. But these are techniques, deliberate techniques they're using to try to increase your likelihood of complying, of donating money, say. So what they do is this. So they call you up and you answer the phone and they say, hi, Mr., Mrs., whatever, how are you today? And you say, I'm fine. They've already got you. They've already got you at this point. When they ask you how you're doing, they're not necessarily just doing it to make small talk. Because when anyone asks you how you're doing, your automatic reaction in almost every case is to say, I'm fine, I'm good, right? It's sort of weird. If someone called you up out of the blue and said, how are you? It's kind of weird to say, oh, well, my elbow's been bothering me lately, right? You wouldn't say that, right? So we all just say, I'm fine. And then the person says the following, well, I'm glad to hear that you're doing well because there are some people in the world who are not doing well and they need your help. Ooh, well, this is a rough one to back out of, right? Because you just said you're doing fine. And if you're doing fine, how could you not donate some money to someone who's not doing as well as you? And research has shown is that simply by getting people to say, I'm fine, in response to a question, how are you? Just getting that commitment increases the likelihood that they will say, donate money to a charity or donate money to a cause. And that's how subtle these techniques are, that you don't even know they're using techniques on you. Toy companies have used these strategies in the past. In particular, toy companies for a long time, and still continuing to this day, had a bit of a problem because they could sell a lot of toys, especially in the lead up to Christmas, for instance. But in the month or two after Christmas, they don't sell a whole lot of toys, right? Because parents have bought all these toys to give their kids for Christmas, so they're probably not going out in January to buy more toys for their kid. So the toy companies had a problem. How do we keep sales high in January and February when there's normally a slump in toy sales? And what they came up with was kind of ingenious, but it relies on this principle of commitment and consistency. So here's the idea. Every now and then, what they would do is they would create a whole lot of hype for a specific toy. And this has happened numerous times over the past few decades. Here's some examples. This happened with Tickle Me Elmos, with Furbies, with Beanie Babies, with Cabbage Patch Dolls, going all the way back to the 80s. They would deliberately create all this hype around a specific toy, and then they would deliberately understock it in their stores in the lead up to Christmas, which seems really weird, right? Why would they deliberately understock a toy when there's a lot of hype about it? Well, what happens is this. So let's say I'm a parent and my child sees a commercial for Tickle Me Elmo, right? And I tell my child, look, if you're good between now and Christmas, I will get you Tickle Me Elmo. And you go to the stores to be consistent with that commitment, right? To buy Tickle Me Elmo for your kid, and they're nowhere to be found. You can't find one anywhere. But the problem is you can't get your kid nothing for Christmas. So you buy a replacement gift, right? A replacement toy. And then lo and behold, 2 days after Christmas, it's a huge shipment in, and Tickle Me Elmos are everywhere. Well, you have committed to your child that you would buy them a Tickle Me Elmo. So what do? On December 27th, you go back to the store, you buy a Tickle Me Elmo for your kid. Now, what these toy companies have done is they've sold you 2 toys for the price of 1, basically, right? By deliberately understocking toys prior to Christmas, you're forced to buy a replacement toy. And then after Christmas, when they get the stock in, because of the principle of commitment and consistency, you feel a need to behave consistently with your past commitments. Even a commitment that you made to, let's say, a 4-year-old child. We feel a need to be consistent with that. So we go back to the store, we buy another toy. So again, by understanding the principle of commitment and consistency, these toy companies and corporations in general can manipulate you into buying their products. So there's 2 specific techniques that I want to talk about that rely on the principle of commitment and consistency. And the first one is easy to get confused with the technique we've already seen. So remember, we saw the door in the face technique. That relies on the principle of reciprocity. What we're going to talk about now is the foot in the door technique, which relies on the principle of commitment and consistency. It's really easy to get those two techniques confused. So make sure you know the difference between door in the face and foot in the door. Here's the idea. The foot in the door technique is basically the opposite of the door in the face technique. What you do, it's a 2-step process. The first thing you do is you get someone to comply with a small request, something that they'll easily say yes to. And once they say yes to that, you increase the size of that request. And because people want to behave consistently with their past commitments, as long as that second larger request is similar in nature to the first request, people will oftentimes feel this pressure to agree to that second request to behave consistently with their prior commitment. I'll give you some examples of how this works. Okay, this is a famous study where what researchers did is they went to different houses in a neighborhood. And they rang the doorbell and they talked to the homeowner and said, look, we're from something like the Committee for Safe Driving or something like that. And we have with us this billboard, and we were wondering if you'd be willing to put this billboard in your front lawn. And you take a look, if you're the homeowner, you take a look at this billboard, and it's this giant thing, and it's got these gaudy colors on it, and it just says, drive carefully, splashed over it. It's this really ugly monstrosity of a billboard. Okay. And so they're asking you if you'd be willing to put this billboard in your front lawn. Okay. Well, what happened is that for half of the people who were asked to do this, about 2 weeks prior to this, they'd been approached by someone else working with the researchers. And they also said that they're from some committee for safe driving. And they were wondering if you'd be willing to put this little small sticker in your front window. So 2 inches by 2 inches, just a really small sticker. Everybody says yes to this. Okay. So when you're asked to put this billboard in your front lawn, half of the participants had already agreed to put a small sticker saying drive carefully in their window, and half the people had never been approached to do that before. So what we're going to look at is the percentage of people who agreed to put this really ugly billboard in their front lawn. So in this control condition, among people who had never been approached prior to this, they'd never been asked to put a sticker in their window. Most people say no, I'm not putting that billboard in my front lawn. Something like 18% of people say yes. The vast majority of people say no, they're not putting it in the front lawn. But if these people had, like 2 weeks earlier, agreed to put a little small sticker in their window, that's all that they did, that number jumps to like 75%. Another huge increase in the likelihood that people would agree to put this really gaudy billboard in their front lawn. Right. Now, why is this happening? Why are we seeing this effect? Well, there's a couple of ways to think about it. I like to think about it in terms of self-perception theory. So imagine that you agree to put this really small sticker in your window. Okay, that says drive carefully. And by engaging in that behavior, you come to think of yourself as someone who is pro-safe driving. I mean, I agreed to put a sticker in my window, right? So I really believe in being pro-safe driving. That's how self-perception theory works, right? We learn about ourselves by thinking about our past behavior. So if I put a sticker in my window, I must really be pro-safe driving. So therefore, when someone comes later on and says, would you be willing to put this billboard in your front lawn that's also pro-safe driving, it says drive carefully. Well, geez, that's consistent with my self-concept. I am someone who is very pro-safe driving. So because of that, to behave consistently with my self-concept, I'm much more likely to agree to put this billboard in my front lawn. Okay. It's not that they're more likely to agree to any larger request. The request has to be related to the smaller request that they had agreed to earlier, right? But because of the principle of commitment and consistency, they're simply much more likely to agree to put this giant billboard in the front lawn. Okay, so that's the foot in the door technique, where a small request makes you more likely to agree to a related larger request. A second technique based on the principle of commitment and consistency is known as lowballing. This one's pretty sketchy, okay? This one's a little of questionable ethics, I guess. I mean, they all are to some extent, but this one probably particularly so. This is also just a two-step process. What people who lowball you will do is they will get you to agree to a certain request. This could be something like buying a car. Let's say you've got a used car salesman, and the used car salesman gets you to agree to buy this car for $20,000. Okay. And I'll tell you what, we'll have it ready for you to pick up tomorrow. So you go home and you're thinking about this car, and this car is yours. In your mind, you've already bought this car, basically, right? And you come back the next day. And the next day when you get back, I say, okay, well, there's actually like a paperwork charge. So it's actually like $22,000 for this car. So what I've done, in other words, is I've revealed hidden costs. I didn't tell you what these costs were up front, right? Yesterday I said you can have this car for $20,000, but today I'm saying it's actually $22,000. It's actually extra charges on this car. But the thing is that by waiting to reveal these hidden costs until later, you are now more likely to agree to buy, in this case, to buy this car for $22,000 compared to if I just told you straight up front that the car was $22,000. Because what's happening is over the prior 24 hours, you've bought this car mentally in your mind, right? You've already thought of what you're going to look like driving this car down the road, and you have this car in your mind. And you've become so attached to this car, you're more likely to agree to these hidden requests or hidden costs later on. You know who does this a lot? Are companies like Ticketmaster. Ticketmaster, those companies drive me crazy, right? I see a concert that I want to go to, and it's $35 for a ticket, let's say. And then I go through this whole process. I put in all my information and my credit card information, my shipping information. I go through multiple pages on a website. And finally I get to the last page, and suddenly the cost is $60. It's $35 for the ticket, plus there's a service and handling fee, and there's a convenience fee and a location fee. There's all these fees, and it's actually $60. Now, they didn't tell me right away that the total cost was $60. They told me it was $35. And they waited until I went through and entered all my information before revealing these hidden costs. That is basically lowballing, right? Because they know that by waiting until the very last web page, you're more likely to agree to those hidden costs because you've gone through all this effort of putting your information in. You've already considered yourself being at this concert. You've talked yourself into it, so you're more likely to agree to those hidden costs. Here's a research example where researchers looked at lowballing. What the researchers did is they called random people. So imagine that you're one of these people. So imagine you get a call from me. And I say, hey, I hear you're in my social psychology class. I know that you can do extra credit in the class. So I'll tell you what, I've got a study it'll only take a half hour of your time. It's an extra credit, you can get extra credit in the class. Would you like to participate? And you say, yeah, that sounds good. I would like some extra credit. So yeah, I'll agree to participate. And once you've agreed, and only once you've agreed, do I then say, okay, it's actually this Saturday at 7 a.m. Okay. Now, contrast that to a second condition in which I call people up from the class and I say, I hear you're in my social psychology class. I know you can do extra credit. I've got a study that you can participate in for extra credit. It's this Saturday at 7 a.m. Would you like to participate? So I reveal those hidden costs up front. Now, in that condition where I tell you the study's at 7 a.m. on Saturday, you can imagine that no one says yes to this, right? Almost everyone says, no, I'm not going to study at 7 a.m. But in the condition where I first got you to agree that yes, you will participate in this study, and I only then tell you that it's Saturday at 7 a.m., suddenly you become much more willing to participate in that study. You're much more likely to agree to keep participating in that study because you feel like you committed to this. You've said, yes, I will participate in this study. And to behave consistently with that commitment, you're likely to agree even when the hidden costs have been revealed. Now, it's a little cheating, right? Because you didn't agree to go to a study at 7 a.m. on Saturday. You just agreed to be in a study. But I make you feel as if you committed to participating in the study, and therefore you're more likely to agree once I reveal the hidden costs. And what the researchers did in the study is they didn't debrief participants at this point. They actually had a study at 7 a.m. just to see if people would show up. And people who had been lowballed did in fact show up to that study. Okay, I'll give you another example. You should be able to hear my audio. This is just a short video clip from the movie Fargo. This guy, Jerry Lundegaard, is a car salesman, and he's in the process of lowballing two people who had, like I think yesterday, agreed to buy a car. Okay. If you can't hear the audio, let me know in the chat. I think you should be able to, hopefully.
Right here in this room and went over this and over this.
Yeah, but that True Coat.
I sat right here and said I didn't want any True Coat.
Yeah, but I'm saying that True Coat, you don't get it. You get oxidation problems. It'll cost you a heck of a lot more than $500.
You're sitting there, you're talking in circles, you're talking like we didn't go over this already.
Yeah, but this True Coat.
We had a deal here for $19,500. You sat there and darned if you didn't tell me you'd get me this car, these options, without the sealant for $19,500.
All right, I'm not saying I didn't.
You called me 20 minutes ago and said you had it ready to make delivery. It says, come on down and get it. And here you are, and you're wasting my time and my wife's time, and I'm paying $19,500 for this vehicle here.
All right. I'll talk to my boss. See, they install that True Coat at the factory. There's nothing we can do. But I'll talk to my boss.
These guys here, these guys, it's always the same. It's always more.
You going to the Gophers on Sunday?
Oh, you betcha.
You wouldn't have an extra ticket.
You kidding?
Well, he never done this before. But seeing as it's special circumstances and all, he says I can knock $100 off that True Coat.
100. You lied to me, Mr. Lundgaard. You're a bald-faced liar.
Bucky, please.
A fucking liar.
Bucky, please.
Where's my goddamn checkbook? Let's get this over with. Where is it?
All right. So what happened here is he got these people to agree to buy the car for $19,500, and only when they came down to pick it up did he say, oh, actually, this is True Coat. This is True Coat they put on the car yet. It's an extra $500. He didn't tell them that ahead of time, right? He waited until he got the agreement first and only then revealed these hidden costs, this extra $500. So he basically lowballed them. The other thing you might have noticed that he did is he used a form of reciprocity, because he went away and he came back and said, hey, my boss said I can knock $100 off the cost. I'm doing you a favor. In fact, he never lets me do this. I'm doing you guys a favor right now by knocking $100 off, with the idea that by making it seem like he's doing them a favor, they're more likely to return the favor by agreeing to buy the car. So we see simultaneously lowballing, which capitalizes on the principle of commitment and consistency, as well as a form of door in the face technique, which capitalizes on the principle of reciprocity. Okay, we've got about 10 minutes left. We're gonna have a quiz. So open up your top hat. Okay, so this quiz is based on questions from the persuasion lecture that I posted on YouTube. So if you have not watched that lecture, you're probably not going to do well on this quiz, but that's okay. I always drop the lowest 4 quizzes, so this could be one of those if you need it to be. Okay, question number 1. In my lecture on persuasion, I discussed the most popular theory in social psychology explaining how people are persuaded, which is known as which of the following? A, the heuristic systemic model of persuasion. B, the dual system persuasion model. C, the elaboration likelihood model. D, the evaluation maintenance model. And you've got 10 seconds. 3, 2, 1. Okay, the correct answer here is C, the elaboration likelihood model. Okay. The heuristic systemic model of persuasion is an actual model that exists in social psychology, but I never talked about it in the lecture. What I talked about was the elaboration likelihood model. In fact, even the title of the lecture is like mindlessness and the ELM. ELM stands for elaboration likelihood model. Question number 2. Which of the following factors will tend to lead people to be on the central route to persuasion? A, if they're highly involved in the issue. B, if they find the speaker attractive. C, if the issue is of low relevance to them. D, if they find the speaker to have expertise on the issue. You've got 10 seconds. 3, 2, 1. Okay, the correct answer here is going to be option A. Okay, most people got it. So according to the elaboration likelihood model, people are persuaded along one of two routes, either the central route to persuasion or the peripheral route to persuasion. That means that people are persuaded by different variables depending on which route to persuasion that they're on. One thing that leads people to be on the central route to persuasion is if an issue is highly relevant to them or if they're highly involved in an issue. If the issue is meaningful to them, then they tend to be on the central route. And the central route to persuasion means that people start focusing on the arguments that are being made by the speaker. So if something matters to you, if you're highly involved in the issue, that will put you on the central route where you're really motivated to think in depth about that issue. Question 3, fear appraisals can be an effective way of persuading people, but only if which of the following is true? A, they are given by a credible speaker. B, the fear is non-threatening. C, they indicate how the danger can be avoided. D, the audience is using the central route to persuasion. got 10 seconds. 3, 2, 1. All right, so I talked about this in my lecture as well. The idea is that fear appraisals, so in other words, if you keep, let's say, smoking cigarettes, or if you keep taking cocaine or whatever, then you will end up dead. That sort of fear appraisal can be an effective way of persuading people to quit doing those behaviors, but only if C, they indicate how the danger can be avoided. Good, so most people got that one. Question 4, George does not like to think or analyze situations very much. George is what we would say either low in need for cognition or high in mindlessness, which, according to the elaboration likelihood model, tends to result in his being persuaded along which route to persuasion, central or peripheral. Ten seconds. 3, 2, 1. Okay, so the idea here is that when people don't like to think very much, that means that they're what we call low in need for cognition. In contrast, there's some people who do like to think a lot more. We would say that they are high in need for cognition. But people who are low in need for cognition tend to not want to analyze the content of messages very much. They tend to be persuaded by more superficial variables, and that's because they're on the peripheral route to persuasion. So B is the correct answer here. Question 5, true or false? Presenting messages subliminally is an effective way to influence people's behavior. So in other words, do subliminal messages work? A, true, they do work, or B, false, they do not work. You got 10 seconds. 3, 2, 1. So as I talk about in the persuasion lecture, in general, subliminal messages do not work to change people's behavior. That is false. People think that they work, and people think their behavior changed if they believe they were exposed to subliminal messages. But in fact, what research studies show is that if you're not aware of having received a message, it has virtually no influence on your behavior, which is a good thing, because if it did, then that means that people could easily control us like robots by constantly giving us subliminal messages that we're unaware of. So it's actually a very good thing that we're not influenced by subliminal messages. Okay. So again, if you have not watched that persuasion lecture, make sure you do so. It is on YouTube. The link to it is in Canvas. I'll hang around for a few minutes if anyone has any issues that you want to talk about. Otherwise, I'll see you guys on Tuesday. See you then. Bye.